For this presentation, we will explore racialized violence within America's history. For centuries, African Americans have been subjected to cruel treatment and punishment because of their quote-unquote race. Up until this day, African Americans are still facing the horrors of white supremacy and violence. So today, we will be using the movies Sankofa, The Great Debaters, The Color Purple, and The Spook Who Sat by the Door, as well as the chapters from our Carson readings, to analyze and visually explain what racialized violence was like for blacks here in America.
To pinpoint the cause of the racialized violence that has been historically targeted against African Americans, we must first address the source of African Americans' assumed racial inferiority, which lies in the origins of white privilege. White privilege and the ethics proceeding from such source back to an era preceding chattel enslavement, otherwise known as Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon, the initiate of the aforementioned 1675 rebellion pitted against Jamestown, Virginia's planter elite, spearheaded well-armed forces of free blacks, runaway slaves, poor white rebels, and white and black indentured servants alike to overthrow the planter elite. As Carson notes on page 56, what began as a frontier war against Native Americans soon turned into a civil war. As free black people and runaway slaves joined the poor white rebels, Bacon's forces turned against planter aristocrats who supported the governor. By the time the violence ebbed, the rebels had burned Jamestown and forced the governor to flee. These acts of radical opposition invoked fear within the white planters, and in efforts to protect their superior status within the social hierarchy and secure their economic endeavors, the employment of indentured servitude was abandoned in exchange for the importation of more black slaves, who were assumed to be a permanent labor force and far more easier to control. To eliminate the possibility of future transracial alliances, the elite traded their pitch of material abundance, such as the acquisition of land for all white indentured servants, to the psychological wage, which was the mere thought of believing in one's own racial superiority. The mere possession of whiteness was used as a form of bait to retain the current systems of social hierarchy and inequality, creating horizontal hostility among the object groups, undoubtedly preventing rebellion or coalition. Poor whites suddenly had a direct personal stake in the existence of a race-based system of slavery. Their own plight had not improved by much, due to the lingering presence of financial hardship and social inequality that existed among these poor whites. They were yet and still extended special race-based rights and privileges like the right to bear arms and ammunition, lighter sentencings and punishments, and the inevitable release from servitude, accompanied by the freedom from having a slave status declared in the womb, of which was a reality for many African Americans in this era. Yet and still, these poor whites upheld that they were not slaves and sought ways to expand their racially privileged position. The attitudes brewed in Bacon's Rebellion have been stimulated all the way to the 21st century as continuation in the marginalization of people of color in various aspects, from distinguished laws like that of Jim Crow, the Black Codes, and today's staggering rates of mass incarceration fueled by the war on drugs, all of which reflect demographic predation and unfortunately afflicts the social, economic, and political endeavors of African Americans today.
By the 1600s, English colonists had established a system of indentured servitude that included both Europeans and Africans. However, after Bacon's Rebellion in 1670, the status of Africans began to change. Scientists, as well as some of the well-known founders of the United States of America, like Thomas Jefferson, had gave race a biological and social hierarchy, thus labeling Africans as inferior and whites as superior, ultimately leaving space and opportunity for the mistreatments of blacks. In the movie Sankofa, we are able to see examples of the cruel punishment and treatment cast upon Africans in some of the earlier years of slavery. In this particular movie, writer and director Garima sends us on a journey to the past to recollect on what life was like for some of our enslaved ancestors. Punishment for slaves varied from burnings at the stake, brandings, whippings, sexual abuse, castration, and even amputation. According to Carson, the harsh penalties and punishments were given out to set examples for other slaves and to decrease the chances of rebellion. During the 1800s, African women slaves, like Shola, were subjected to sexual exploitation and abuse by white slave masters. In the 1600s, laws were already implemented that gave consent to interracial marriages and relationships only between African women slaves and white slave masters, in order to extend slave status to the womb. However, these laws left African women more vulnerable to rape and sexual abuse, as seen in the way Shola was continuously raped by the Lafayette plantation owner.
The Great Debaters is a counter-hegemonic production depicting the nearly undefeated reign of the Wiley College Forensic Society of 1935 and 1936. Spearheaded by Professor Melvin Tolson within a small, predominantly black institution in Marshall, Texas, the Wiley College Forensic Society consisted of 4 profound debaters, of which includes James Farmer Jr., Henry Lowe, Samantha Book, and Hamilton Burgess, who ultimately renounces. The Great Debaters embodies resilience in the midst of adversity and the defiance of socio-political normalities, perseveringly combating the racisms of Jim Crow, sexism, and violence perpetuated by the race relations of 1935 and 1936. Race relations amongst African Americans and Anglo-Saxons were intensified by Jim Crow, which, as Carson notes on page 323, was convinced by the pseudo-scientific racism that defined African Americans as inferior. State and local governments initiated new laws and customs, often enforced by violence, increasingly restricting black freedom and opportunity. So much that African Americans during this time not only faced the threat of a loss of rights, but also a loss of their lives. Through a tirade exerted by Henry Lowe, lynchings were expressed as a prominent factor of what life was like for African Americans during the 1930s under the cast of Jim Crow. Carson reaffirms the aforementioned notion in his dissertation featured in Chapter 14, explicating lynchings of African Americans during the 1900s. Page 357 reads, "Wives warned husbands and parents cautioned sons about traveling alone. Every family knew of men who had mysteriously disappeared, only to be found drowned, hanged, or beaten. Black women or girls considered uppity, which translates to disrespectful to white people, risked rape by white men, as well as lynchings." Lowe stresses that this form of extrajudicial punishment had been employed by white lynch mobs for the most minuscule of reasons, including phenotypically identifying as African American. An African American can be hanged for standing up to disrespectful whites, running for office, voting, mere friendliness, or even eye contact with a white woman could get a young black man killed. African Americans during this era lived in constant threat of white lynch mobs, especially the Ku Klux Klan. During the 1930s, under the racial caste system of Jim Crow, African Americans were confined to the assumption of a second-class citizenship within their social, political, and economic endeavors, including that of which was encompassed within the educational sector. African Americans were not only subjected to the separate but equal discourse that limited their civil rights for more than half a century. In fact, as detailed on page 323 of the Carson Struggle for Freedom text, with this Plessy versus Ferguson decision upholding racial segregation, the Supreme Court led a backlash against federal protections for black citizens. The Plessy versus Ferguson ruling solidified the deconstruction of black civil rights, and in combination with the ethics of Jim Crow, African Americans were barred from attending Anglo-Saxon universities, directly examinable in the manner the Wiley College Forensic Society of 1935 and 1936 had been rejected on a plethora of occasions when extending debate invitations to predominantly Anglo-Saxon universities, and in the instance their invitation was accepted, the Wiley College Forensic Society had been scheduled to debate at an off-site location due to the fact they were barred from the campus of Oklahoma City University on the basis that they were a predominantly black institution. The Supreme Court's upholding of this racial segregation deteriorated federal protections for black citizens and essentially enabled the cruel bias and violent discrimination experienced by 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, who integrated the predominantly white William Franz Elementary School in Louisiana in the year of 1960, and the Little Rock Nine, who desegregated Little Rock Central High School in the year of 1957. Both Ruby Bridges and the Little Rock Nine were approached by mobs of angry white segregationists who threw things and shouted very derogatory comments towards these black students. Ruby Bridges has attested to the fact that one woman threatened to poison her every morning as she walked to school, and that another woman protested outside of her school with a black baby doll in a coffin. All of which was done in combat to these students' admission into these predominantly Anglo-Saxon institutions. The threat of mob violence and retaliation was so adverse that Ruby Bridges and the Little Rock Nine had to be escorted to and from school as they traveled each day.
The racialized violence displayed in The Color Purple is just an example of what was occurring all throughout the South in the 1940s. The scene where Sophia goes to jail is just an example of the effects that the Jim Crow laws had on the black people in the South. The Jim Crow laws were a series of ordinances that legalized the racial segregation between white and black people. According to Carson's text, even veterans experience racialized violence just as Sophia did. There was an incident in Tennessee where a veteran was defending his mom who had been slapped by a white repairman. After he beat up the repairman, the KKK and local police began to terrorize black homes and businesses. In both of these situations, the police and white citizens felt that they were superior to black people and believed that blacks do not deserve equal treatment. In the movies The Spook Who Sat by the Door, racialized violence was the CIA providing poverty-stricken black communities with crack to create the war on drugs. They put the drugs in poverty communities to help them extinct themselves. In the film, one of the guys that Dan is training gets killed by the police for selling drugs, and this begins a revolt in the community. The community's reaction started an unaccompanied act of defiance to grow into a mass movement. Martin Luther King was a civil rights activist who was assassinated by a white man because he was fighting for racial equality. Emmett Till was a young boy killed by a group of white men for allegedly insulting a white woman. They beat and mutilated his body before shooting him and sinking his body in a river. They were both murdered unjustly and are examples of racialized violence. The bottom two images display the treatment of blacks during the civil rights movement in the late 50s through the 60s, where mostly black protesters would sometimes be hosed down by the local fire department or attacked by police dogs.
Today, African Americans are still haunted by the violence that comes with being a part of the black race. Nationwide, there are countless cases of racialized violence, and the prime victim being black. Whether male or female, the mistreatment of blacks is deeply rooted in American history and is still walking along the surface of the 21st century. Blacks were originally brought over here as property and commodity, and when this was challenged, violence was used to make blacks obey. Although slavery is no longer a myth, the system and hierarchy still is.